The afternoon sun slanted through the half-open shutters of Edward Cavalcante's private study, cutting through the air-conditioned atmosphere in golden bands that provided absolutely no warmth. There was an almost poetic irony in it, light attempting to enter a space where heat had never truly settled. 43. That was the number Edward had stopped celebrating long ago, replacing cakes and candles with meetings and contracts signed with the cold precision of someone who learned early on that feelings have a cost, and that the cost is always too high. Cavalcante Developments was the largest construction firm in the state of New York in terms of high-end residential volume. Gated communities in the Hamptons, penthouses on the Upper West Side, corporate towers in Midtown, the Cavalcante name was etched in granite and steel across dozens of addresses in the city. Edward had built all of it with his own hands, not in the literal sense, but in that heavier, more exhausting sense that ambitious men carry like a medal. Through years of interrupted sleep, cancelled lunches and relationships abandoned by the roadside, while the company surged forward. The mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, spanned 12,000 square feet across 3 floors, featuring a heated pool he used perhaps 3 times a year, a 6-car garage filled with vehicles that only left for business events, and an impeccable garden that the gardener, Mr. Benedict, tended with the dedication of someone cultivating something sacred. Edward rarely stepped into the garden. He rarely stepped anywhere in the house that wasn't his private study, his bedroom, or the kitchen, when hunger finally overcame his reluctance to call for help. That Friday afternoon in March had started like any other. Edward arrived from the central office in Manhattan at 6 o'clock, greeted the mansion staff with a nod that felt more like a roll call than a greeting, and settled behind the solid oak desk to continue the work he had brought home. 3 projects lay on the desk: a luxury estate in Greenwich, a corporate complex in Stamford, and a contract revision that his partner, Robert Drummond, had requested urgently. The supply chain crisis had squeezed delivery deadlines, and Edward needed to reorganize profit margins before the investors' meeting scheduled for the following week. He slightly loosened his tie, navy blue Italian silk, a piece that cost the equivalent of a month-and-a-half's salary for many of his employees, but which he wore with the nonchalance of someone who doesn't think about money because he never needed to save it. He adjusted the reading glasses he only wore when no business associates were around and dove into the numbers. It was in this state of absolute concentration that he felt safest. Numbers didn't lie, didn't ask for more than they could offer, didn't look at him with expectation or judgment. Numbers were honest in a way people rarely managed to be. Mrs. Lewis, the cook who had worked at the mansion for 12 years, had left fresh coffee and a tray of scones on the silver tray beside the desk. Edward drank the coffee without noticing the flavor and didn't touch the food. Not out of indifference, but because when he was inside a project, the outside world simply ceased to exist. It had been this way since he was 20. Since he had left rural Pennsylvania to study civil engineering at Columbia University, and since he had realized that the only place he was treated as someone capable was inside a classroom or before a drafting table. Rural Pennsylvania was where he was born, but it was never where he belonged. The son of a mechanic and a seamstress, he grew up in a simple neighborhood where the idea of building structures taller than 4 stories was otherworldly. His father had passed away when Edward was 16, and from then on he had assumed the responsibility of supporting the household while preparing for university entrance exams. He got into Columbia on his first try. His mother cried with pride, and he promised her those tears would be the last ones of sadness she would ever shed because of him. He kept that promise. He gave her a house of her own back home, a comfortable monthly pension, and visits on Christmas and her birthday. It was all he could offer without giving up what he had built for himself. What he hadn't managed to build, and he knew this with the uncomfortable clarity that 40 years bring to the honest, was anything resembling a real emotional life. He had had 3 serious relationships over the years. The first, Anne, was an engineer like him, and had understood the dedication to work until the day she realized there was no room for a child in that schedule. The second, Rachel, was a lawyer, and had lasted 2 years before saying, as bluntly as her profession demanded, that loving someone who is never present is the slowest form of loneliness. The third, Claire, had tried to change him into someone else and discovered that Edward Cavalcante was not material for transformation. He was material for completion. Each relationship had ended without grand scenes or violent accusations, and that tranquility at the end was perhaps the most definitive sign that none of the three had ever truly gotten close. There was no regret in it, or at least that's what he told himself when the silence of the mansion grew too heavy to ignore. There was a difference, he thought, between being alone and solitude. Solitude was a choice. It was the peace of someone who opted for professional excellence over the complications of a shared daily life. Loneliness was something else. It was what knocked on the door on Sunday nights when the projects were closed, and there was nothing between him and his own silence. At 6:45 that afternoon, Edward was completely absorbed in the numbers for the Greenwich project when he heard a sound that was not part of the mansion's acoustic routine. It wasn't the soft sound of the staff's footsteps on the marble hallway, nor the familiar creak of the wooden doors, nor the distant murmur of the television Mrs. Lewis left on in the pantry while she tidied the kitchen. It was something different, something smaller. A sound of quick, irregular footsteps, the steps of someone who hadn't yet learned that the world demands we move with caution. He looked up from the documents by reflex, not interest, and then the study door opened. It hadn't been knocked on. It hadn't been announced. It had simply been pushed open by a pair of small hands with the unpretentious determination of someone who knows no hierarchies and hasn't yet learned that there are places where children do not go. A girl of about 6 years old crossed the threshold with confident strides that didn't match the diminutive size of her body. She wore a blue dress with small yellow star patterns, pink sandals with the Velcro strap slightly loose on one side, and her hair was tied in 2 pigtails that had clearly started the day more organized than they currently were. Edward went completely still. In 43 years of life, in dozens of tense meetings with investors, in moments of financial pressure that would have folded weaker men, he had never felt this particular kind of paralysis. It was as if his brain had received information for which it had no response protocol. The girl walked to the desk without hesitation, the same solid oak desk that the most senior partners approached with a kind of involuntary reverence, and stood at the edge, looking up with a pair of brown eyes that held a depth absolutely disproportionate to her age. Then she raised her arm, reached for the navy blue Italian silk tie with her small fingers, and pulled gently, as if the act were the most natural thing in the world. And she shouted, with the happy clarity of someone announcing something absolutely unquestionable, "Daddy!" Edward Cavalcanti, the man who had negotiated 8-figure contracts without blinking, felt the air leave his lungs all at once. His pen dropped onto the architectural plans for the Greenwich estate, leaving a blotch of black ink on the expensive paper. And in that instant, for a reason he wouldn't be able to name in words for many days to come, something inside the chest of that serious, lonely man trembled like a structure hit by a force that calculations had not predicted. The voice of Mary Stevens arrived before her body did, a stifled sound, almost breathless, mixing her daughter's name with a rushed apology, the kind of voice produced when the heart is already in the throat and words must find space between panic and shame. She appeared in the doorway seconds later, the coffee tray trembling in her hands to the point where the empty cup clinked lightly against the white porcelain saucer. "Isabel," her voice was firm despite the tremor. "Come here, now." Edward hadn't moved. He remained in the same position as when the pen had fallen, hands on the desk, glasses slightly slipped down his nose, eyes fixed on the girl, with an expression that wasn't anger or pure surprise, but something closer to the state of someone who had just received information and didn't yet know where to put it. The ink stain on the expensive paper had spread a bit more, and he had done nothing to stop it. Mary had worked at the mansion for 3 years and had learned very quickly that there were unwritten rules more severe than the written ones. The private study was untouchable territory, not because Edward had explicitly said so, but because there was a gravity in that room that everyone felt without needing an explanation. The dark wood of the bookshelves, the rows of books organized by subject, the oak desk that seemed to anchor the space with the authority of a monument. Everything there communicated that this place belonged to a world that was not theirs. And now Isabel was in the middle of that world, in her pink sandals and yellow star dress, holding the end of the Italian silk tie of the most important man in the house, with the absolute naturalness of someone who knows no boundaries because no one had bothered to explain them to her. "Mr. Cavalcante, I am so sorry. It was a lapse on my part. She shouldn't have left the kitchen. I'll take her out right now." Mary set the tray on the sideboard near the door with a speed bordering on recklessness and walked toward her daughter. Edward raised his hand, a simple gesture, palm open, which in the body language of that man was equivalent to a clear instruction. "Leave her." Mary stopped. Isabel looked at her mother, then at the man behind the desk, and decided the situation was completely under control, because to her, clearly, it was. She released the tie gently and rested both hands on the edge of the desk, standing on her tiptoes to see the paper-covered surface better. "You have a lot of papers," she observed with the tone of someone who isn't judging, just noticing. Edward looked at the desk, as if seeing it for the first time through her eyes. There was indeed an intimidating amount of documents, blueprints, bound reports, and colored folders. To a 6-year-old, it must have looked like the natural habitat of a strange creature. "I do," he agreed. His own voice sounded different to him, less sharp, less corporate. Mary had worked at that mansion for 3 years, with the absolute discretion of someone who understands that invisibility, in that context, is a form of competence. She was 32, born in Hartford, Connecticut, into a family of 4 siblings, and had arrived in Greenwich with a medium-sized suitcase and a 3-year-old daughter by the hand after ending a marriage that had started with promises that never turned into real support. Isabel's father had left when the girl wasn't even crawling yet, leaving behind an apartment with overdue rent and a shut-off water bill as a parting gift. She had learned to survive with the silent efficiency of people who have no safety net and know that the only thread holding them up is their own competence. She got her first domestic job during that phase through a woman from the church she attended on Sundays, a family in Stamford who had treated her with the distant politeness that certain social classes reserve for those who perform the service but do not share the table. She had stayed there for 4 years, enough to build a solid reference, a tiny savings account, and a routine that Isabel had already memorized completely. Then came the pneumonia. Isabel had caught it in the winter, a Monday in January when her fever hit 103, and the pediatrician at the clinic had ordered immediate hospitalization. 3 nights at the municipal hospital, with Mary sleeping in the chair beside the bed, leaving only to grab coffee in the hallway and call her employer to say she couldn't come in. On Wednesday morning, when Isabel was stabilized but still under observation, the employer had called back to say they needed someone with more availability. The phrase had been chosen with surgical precision so as not to sound like what it was. She had left that job with just enough money for the following month, and Isabel still with a cough that took weeks to fully disappear. She had found the ad for the position at the Cavalcante mansion through a colleague from the old neighborhood, had gone through 3 different interviews, and in a brief formal moment had been received by Edward himself, who had asked 3 practical questions and dismissed everything in less than 8 minutes. She had been hired because she had proven experience, references from before the incident with her daughter, and because she didn't ask for more than what was agreed. 3 years later, she still earned the same salary. She had never asked for a raise, not because she didn't need it, but because she had learned that in that man's world, those who ask seem dissatisfied, and those who seem dissatisfied are dismissed. She needed that job like the structure of a building needs its pillars. Isabel's daycare, the rent on their 2-bedroom apartment, groceries, the basic health plan from her formal employment. It was a fair equation with nothing left over, and Mary had learned the balance with the precision of someone with no margin for error. What she hadn't told anyone was that there was another reason why this specific job had seemed in that moment of desperation almost like a sign from fate. The library. The Cavalcante mansion had a private library on the 2nd floor, with over 2,000 volumes organized by subject: history, engineering, philosophy, management, psychology, American and world literature. She had seen it for the first time when she was shown the floors during the hiring process, and she had felt something she didn't quite know how to name, a kind of hunger that wasn't for food. She had finished her sophomore year of high school before life made continuing impossible. She had never stopped wanting more. She had never stopped believing that more was possible, even when everything around her suggested otherwise. In the 3 years that followed, she had developed a system, She would take one book at a time, always after finishing the day's work, always putting it back in the exact spot before leaving. She never took them home, never folded pages, never left any visible mark. It was a silent loan that no one had authorized, and which she treated with the same care she gave to the fine porcelain and antique furniture. She had read about American history, Western philosophy, and management theories that made more sense once you knew the inner workings of a large household. And she had found on a middle shelf a collection of psychology books that she had started reading 6 months prior, with the veracity of someone who finally finds the language that was always their own. None of this was crossing Mary's mind at that moment. What was crossing it was an accelerated, anguished version of damage control, how much that innocent invasion might cost her. Isabel had let go of the tie and was now pointing at the ink stain on the paper. "It slipped," she said with a genuine compassion completely out of proportion to the situation. And then Edward Cavalcante did something Mary hadn't seen in 3 years of service at that mansion. He looked at the girl for real, with actual attention, not with the distracted look people give children when they are busy with adult things, and he answered in a voice slightly different from his contract voice. "It did slip. There was something in that." Mary couldn't say exactly what, but there was something that hadn't been there before the door was pushed open by Isabel's small fingers, and which now occupied the study along with the smell of cold coffee and the ink stain on the Greenwich plans. It was a different kind of silence from the other silences in that house. And Mary, who had learned to read the silences of that mansion better than any behavior manual could teach, felt that this one in particular didn't have a name yet, but that it would, at some point yet to come. Mary had learned to control many things over the years. The exhaustion that appeared in her eyes after a late night of studying by the light of her phone, the hurt that tried to rise when someone treated her as if she were invisible, the smile that had to exist even on days when the bank account said there was no room for error. But at that moment, standing in the doorway of the most inaccessible study in that mansion, watching her 6-year-old daughter hold the boss's tie and proclaim him her father with the conviction of someone announcing a geographical fact, that kind of control was completely out of her reach. Isabel Victoria Stevens. Her voice came out tighter than she intended, using the 3 parts of the name that mothers reserve for moments when a situation has moved beyond normal control into the territory of no return. "Come here." Isabel looked at her mother with that specific expression of children who know they've done something wrong, but still can't understand why, since from their point of view, everything seems perfectly reasonable. She released the tie carefully and took a step to the side as if she were merely repositioning herself, not exactly obeying. "Can I stay a little longer?" Edward had regained the ability to move his body, but he hadn't said anything yet. He continued looking at the girl with a concentrated attention Mary had never seen on that face, and she had observed that face from afar for 3 years in an involuntary exercise that anyone working in an environment of power develops to survive, learning to read the mood of the room by the mood of the person in charge. "Mr. Cavalcante, I am truly sorry." Mary's words came out fast and controlled. "She came to visit me today. I watch her in the back when the work is light. I shouldn't have let her out of the kitchen. I promise it won't happen again." Edward still hadn't spoken, but when he opened his mouth, what came out wasn't what she had prepared herself to hear. "Why did you call me that?" The question was directed at Isabel in a voice that had lost its formal edges without him seeming to notice. "Daddy, why did you say that?" Isabel considered the question with the seriousness of someone being treated as if their opinions mattered, which was, she felt instinctively, a rare gesture of respect. She crossed her arms over her chest with a small, old gesture that Mary recognized as the posture her daughter adopted when she was about to explain something she considered obvious to slow adults. "Because you let Mommy work here," Isabel began, counting on her fingers with the method of a carefully constructed argument. "And when she works, she gets money to buy food for me. That's what daddies do." Edward didn't move. "And also," second finger, "when you pass in the hallway, you go like this to me." Isabel executed a slight, almost imperceptible nod of the head, a surprisingly faithful imitation of the gesture Edward himself made when he crossed paths with someone from the staff in the mansion's corridors. "The other big adults don't do that to me. You do." Third finger. And Mommy is happy when the job is going well. When she's happy, we watch cartoons at night and she's not worried. A good daddy lets Mommy be happy. The silence that settled after those 3 sentences was of a different nature than all the other silences Mary had experienced in that mansion. There was a different weight to it. Not the weight of what wasn't said, but the weight of what had been said so simply and so completely that there was no room for addition. Mary felt the heat rise in her cheeks and pressed her lips together tightly. It wasn't shame, or not just shame. It was something more complicated, more exposed. The specific feeling of having your private life suddenly illuminated by a light source you didn't choose and couldn't turn off. Isabel had summarized in 3 childhood arguments what 3 years of discreet silence and invisible work had built, and she had offered it all to the most formal and distant man in the house, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Edward lowered his eyes to the desk for a moment. The ink stain had dried on the expensive paper in an irregular shape that spread like a river delta over the graph paper. He looked at it as if it were a new element of the project. Then he looked back at the girl. "How old are you?" "6, but I'll be 7 in June." The distinction was important to her, evidently. Months counted, especially those separating one number from the next. "And what do you want to be when you grow up?" The answer came without hesitation, with the solidity of a decision made long ago and revisited many times, as if it were already a permanent part of who she was. "An architect. To build a house for me and Mummy where she doesn't have to clean anyone's floors." Edward stared at the girl for a time that felt long, though no one in the room knew how to measure it exactly. There was something in his silence that was different from the silence he used in business meetings. The latter was strategic, calculated, the silence of someone waiting for the right moment to speak and knowing that the wait increases the weight of the words. The silence now was of another kind. It was the silence of someone listening to something they didn't expect to hear and not knowing yet what to do with it. Mary had heard that answer before. Isabel had been repeating it for months, ever since she had learned the word architect from a book her mother had brought from the second-floor library without anyone knowing. But hearing it in that specific context, in that study, before the man who had built half of the luxury buildings in the state of New York, had a completely different resonance. It was like hearing a song you know by heart, being played by an instrument that had never played that melody before. Edward stood up from his chair. It was a slow, deliberate movement, and for some reason Isabel didn't flinch. She stayed in place, looking up as the tall man rose before her, with the tranquility of someone who isn't afraid of things they don't yet understand. He went to the window overlooking the garden, stood with his back to the two of them for a few seconds, looking at the lawn that Mr. Benedict had trimmed last Tuesday with the geometric precision of a carpet. "Mrs. Lewis will bring you some juice," he said without turning around. "You can wait in the room next door." It was the gentlest dismissal that Study had seen in years. Isabel left without needing to be called twice, her quick, irregular steps fading down the hall toward the living room, where the sofa was too big for a child and therefore perfect for exploration. Mary stood still, waiting. There was no way to know what came next, and she had learned that when you don't know what comes next, the wisest thing is to stay quiet and let the other person choose the tone. Edward turned. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't precisely identify because she hadn't seen it in the boss's facial repertoire before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't the neutral condescension with which some bosses look at employees when they need to remember the distance between them. It was something less categorizable. "You may go," he said. "Just that, you may go." Mary picked up the tray she had left on the sideboard and exited the study with the measured steps of someone aware they are being watched, even when no one is looking directly. She closed the door carefully, leaned her back against the marble hallway for 2 seconds, exactly 2 seconds, and then headed to the kitchen with a straight spine and dry eyes, because she had learned a long time ago that tears have a proper time, and the proper time is never when everyone is still around. Edward was left alone in the study. The documents remained on the desk. The coffee had grown cold. The ink stain on the Greenwich plans had dried in an irregular shape that was impossible to ignore every time his gaze landed on the paper. He stood by the window for a time he couldn't measure. The garden outside was identical to what it had been 20 minutes ago. The sun had dipped a little lower, Mr. Benedict had moved out of sight among the rose bushes. The outside world continued with the usual indifference of things that don't know something has changed. But something in the study was different. And Edward Cavalcante, who had built an entire company on the ability to identify what changed in a project before anyone else had to point it out, knew that the difference wasn't in the papers or the furniture or the light coming through the shutters. It was in him. And that, for a reason that wouldn't fit into any spreadsheet he could build, was the most disconcerting part of everything that had happened that afternoon. From the room next door came the sound of Isabel thanking Mrs. Lewis for the juice in that voice that didn't distinguish between those who deserved gratitude and those who didn't. She thanked everyone with the same sincere intensity, because no one had yet taught her that the world prefers when we dose our affection according to hierarchy. Edward heard that small sound and looked at the garden for longer than he had planned. Edward couldn't sleep well that night. It wasn't a new occurrence. There were periods when projects chased him into the early hours with the persistence of unresolved problems, and he had developed a functional relationship with insomnia over the years. He would stay in bed until 2 or 3 in the morning reading contracts on his tablet, and at some point, exhaustion would overcome logic, and sleep would arrive through sheer weariness. But that night, there was no contract on the tablet. There was the white ceiling of the bedroom, and the floor fan in the corner that he turned on even in the mild winter, because absolute silence was more disturbing than any soft, regular noise. He knew what he was doing. He was trying not to think about the 3 reasons of a 6-year-old girl, and so, naturally, that was exactly what he thought about. Because you let mommy work here. When she works, she gets money to buy food for me. Edward had given salaries to hundreds of employees over his career. It was a contractual transaction, service rendered, corresponding remuneration. He had never thought, when signing the payroll, that in some 2-bedroom apartment on a street in Stamford, that amount was being transformed into food on the table of a 6-year-old child. Not because he was indifferent, or at least that's what he told himself, but because it simply wasn't the way numbers worked in his head. To him, they were cells in a spreadsheet. To Isabel, they were dinner. There was a difference between those 2 ways of seeing the same number that bothered him in a way he didn't know how to put into words. And so he tried to put it into sleep. Sleep didn't come. Dawn did, grey and damp, as March Saturdays in Connecticut often are, with that specific smell of wet earth rising from the gardens when the early morning drizzle has passed. At 8 in the morning, Edward was already in the study. He wasn't working. He was sitting in the leather armchair next to the south bookshelf, the armchair where he sat when he needed to think instead of execute, with a cup of coffee that Mrs. Lewis had left at the door without knocking, because she had learned years ago that the boss felt people's presence before he heard them. She had mentioned that once to the staff, with a slightly superstitious admiration that Edward would have pragmatically debunked if he knew. He simply paid attention to the sound of footsteps, and Mrs. Lewis had a specific way of walking when she brought coffee. The noise that arrived this time was different. Broom strokes, the characteristic sound of bristles on the marble of the hallway, a sound he had heard for 3 years without ever stopping to identify it as something coming from someone with a name and a story. Mary was cleaning the downstairs hallway. Edward stood up from the armchair, went to the study door and opened it with a naturalness intended to seem casual. She was with her back to him, broom handle in her hands, her hair tied in a bun that had started out more organized and now had a few strands loose at the nape of her neck. She wore the house uniform, the light blue cotton blouse and black trousers that she kept impeccably pressed, which Edward had never noticed before, and noticed now with a focus that surprised him. Mary turned when she heard the door. The expression on her face was neutral, the kind of neutrality built with effort and maintained with discipline. She had arrived early that Saturday, as she always did, and had spent the first 2 hours waiting, without wanting to admit to herself she was waiting, for some consequence of the previous afternoon. "Good morning, Mr. Cavalcante." "Good morning." He stood in the doorway for a moment. "Isabel didn't come today?" The question surprised her. She managed not to let the surprise show on her face. "No, sir. On Saturdays she stays with the neighbor, Mrs. Harrison. She only comes when there's lighter work and I can leave her in the back while I work." He nodded, as if that information were being filed away somewhere internally. Then he stepped back into the study and closed the door. Mary stood still for a few seconds with the broom in her hands before resuming her movement. It was strange. Everything in those 24 hours had been strange in a way she still hadn't managed to classify properly. She had spent the previous night expecting the worst and woke up with the uncertainty intact, which was, paradoxically, almost worse than a bad decision. Uncertainty doesn't let you plan. Uncertainty demands you stay awake even when the body asks for rest. Edward, inside the study, stood by the window for an unnecessarily long time before remembering he had gone there to think, not to look at the garden again. He returned to the armchair, picked up the now lukewarm cup of coffee, and drank without noticing the temperature. In the garden, Mr. Benedict had arrived and was pruning the side rose bushes with the large garden shears he kept in a wooden box near the garage. At 62, Benedict Miller was the oldest employee on the property. He had arrived before Edward. He had been hired by the previous owner, a retired accountant who had sold the mansion 10 years ago, and had stayed for the simple reason that he knew the name of every plant in the garden, and none of the candidates who came after knew as much as he did. Edward respected competence without needing to express it verbally, and Benedict had learned to read that respect without needing to hear it. It was a mutual understanding that bypassed conversation and therefore lasted. An hour later, when Edward went out for air, a habit he acquired only in moments when his head felt too heavy for another hour in the study, Benedict looked up from the rose bushes with that quiet frankness of someone who doesn't need a new job and therefore has no reason to lie. "Morning, sir." "Benedict." Edward stopped near the edge of the walkway, separating the stone from the grass. "Are the rose bushes having problems?" "Those in the east corner, yes, fungus. But I've treated it." The old gardener looked at him with eyes that had seen too much to pretend they saw nothing. "The little girl from yesterday was lively, wasn't she? She came by here this morning before going in with her mother and kept asking me a bunch of questions about the flowers." Edward hadn't known Isabel had arrived that morning. She had arrived with Mary, apparently, and spent time exploring the garden while her mother prepared the work, and then, at some point in the afternoon, had escaped the kitchen and decided to explore the rest of the house with the irresistible logic of someone who doesn't know the maps of forbidden places. "What did she ask?" Benedict smiled in a way that made the wrinkles around his eyes deepen into an expression Edward associated with people who aged without losing the capacity to find amusement in the world. "If the rose feels pain when we cut it." I said I didn't know for sure. She said she'd find out when she became a doctor. He shook his head with genuine affection that wasn't performance. Then she said she was going to be an architect. Then she said she was going to be both at the same time because a house also needs someone to look after the people living in it. Edward stared at the rose bushes for a moment without responding. The child's logic had that specific quality of truths that arrive obliquely and land in places you weren't defending. She said she was going to be an architect to build a house where her mother didn't have to clean anyone's floors, Edward said, more to himself than to the gardener. Benedict nodded slowly, like someone recognizing the weight of a sentence even when they don't know the whole story behind it. "Children have a clarity that we lose over time," he said simply. Then he went back to his shears with the same rhythm as always, as if that were all there was to say, and more than enough. Edward went back inside. He climbed the stairs to the second floor, walked the main hallway with the slow steps of someone in no hurry to get anywhere, because they don't yet know where they want to go, and stopped before the library door. He went in. The library had walls covered from floor to ceiling with dark wood shelves, and natural light entered through two high windows with beige linen curtains that filtered the grey of the March day into a tone more golden than the sky deserved. Edward rarely went in there on weekends. It was a space he had inherited from the previous owner, along with part of the books, and he had supplemented it over the years with acquisitions reflecting his own interests: engineering, economic history, pragmatic philosophy, some biographies of entrepreneurs he had read and forgotten at the same speed he had bought them. He scanned the shelves without a clear goal. He reached the psychology section, a row of 12 volumes he had bought in a lot from a used bookstore because they were well bound and would fill the available space nicely. He hadn't read any of them. There was something different about two of them. Not obviously different. There was nothing out of place that any ordinary person would notice. But Edward had an eye trained for proportion and alignment since his drafting days in college, and there were two spines slightly further out than the others, as if the volumes had been removed and replaced with care, but not with enough precision to fool an eye trained to find the missing millimeter. He stared at those two spines for a long moment, without touching anything. Then he left the library, went down the stairs and passed through the hallway where Mary had resumed her usual work. She was cleaning the mirror in the entrance hall with a microfiber cloth, her back to him, with the circular and precise movements of someone who doesn't need to look at what they are doing, because they've done it so many times. Their arms know the way on their own. Edward kept walking toward the study. But he kept thinking, and this was a state that, unlike other days, had no project as its object. Monday began for Edward Cavalcante in the same way as every Monday for the last several years. Alarm at 6:30, quick coffee in the kitchen, car leaving the garage at 7:20 to arrive at the Manhattan office before 8, when the staff began to arrive and the questions began. He preferred that silent 40-minute window before the official start of the workday to organize what he had thought about at home and turn intentions into an agenda. On that particular Monday, however, the agenda had an item he hadn't planned the night before, and which had simply appeared in his head at 6 in the morning with the persistence of thoughts that don't wait for an invitation to exist. At 8:12 in the morning, he called Christine Miller, the administrative manager who handled all HR processes for both the central office and the mansion, on the intercom. "Christine, I need the complete file on Mary Stevens, staff at the Greenwich residence." There was a very brief pause. The kind competent people make when a request is unexpected but not questionable, just unexpected. "Of course, Mr. Cavalcante. How soon do you need it?" "Before lunch." The file arrived at 11:20, delivered by Christine herself in a sealed manila envelope. Edward waited for her to leave and opened it on the glass desk of the central office. Unlike the oak one at the mansion, this one was more contemporary, more corporate, more compatible with the pace of quick decisions that had to be made in that space every day. Mary Christine Stevens, 32 years old, born in Hartford, resident of Stamford, single mother of Isabel Victoria Stevens, 6 years old. He scanned the professional history. Her education was on the second line, high school incomplete sophomore year. The gap there had the specific weight of stories not told in a resume. When life abruptly changes course, and academic plans are the first to be discarded because they seem the most replaceable, though they usually aren't. Below, in smaller print and in parentheses, as if the candidate knew it was little but had chosen to be honest anyway. Intend to resume studies. Long-term goal. Degree in psychology. Edward read that line twice, then a third time slower. The employment history listed 3 positions prior to Cavalcante. The last one, the most recent before arriving at the mansion, had lasted 4 years in a residence in Stamford. In the exit remarks field, which Christine had filled in at the time based on information from the candidate during the hiring interview, there was a dry note: terminated at employer's request due to reduced availability. Candidate reports needing to accompany hospitalized daughter and was dismissed during the absence period. There were no details beyond that. No need for additional details. The equation was complete in one line. She had put her daughter's life above her job and had been punished for it by the person who, of all people in the world, should have been able to understand. Edward closed the file and stared at the wall for a few minutes. In his field of vision was a window overlooking Park Avenue below, and the flow of cars and pedestrians continued with the democratic indifference of big cities, which move forward regardless of what is happening in any office, on any floor of any building. He had seen that same view hundreds of times and had never thought about who the people in those cars were, where they were going, what they had left behind to get there. The 11:30 meeting with Robert Drummond about the Greenwich contracts went faster than usual because Edward was only partially present. His body was in the boardroom chair, signing where necessary and responding where asked. But part of his attention remained on that line in the resume in parentheses. Long-term goal, degree in psychology. Written 3 years ago by a woman then looking for domestic work with a 3-year-old daughter and a compromised reference, who had put that there with the discreet honesty of someone who didn't want to lie, but also didn't want to overexpose what she knew no one would take seriously. That night, Back at the mansion, Edward went straight to the library. Mary had finished her shift at 6 and left to pick up her daughter from Mrs. Harrison's house. Edward arrived at 8, which meant the second floor was empty. Mrs. Lewis had left dinner on the covered tray in the kitchen and left as well, as she lived nearby and rarely stayed past 7 when there was no extraordinary demand. The library had that specific silence of places where books keep what people say when no one is listening. Edward went directly to the psychology section. He pulled out the first of the 2 volumes he had noticed on Saturday, Psychology of Human Development, a university edition with a dark blue cover and edges slightly yellowed by time. He opened it carefully, holding it by the spine like someone who knows how to handle delicate things. The book was not underlined. There were no pen marks, no dog-eared pages, no kind of intervention that could be identified by any other reader as evidence of frequent use. But there was something more subtle. Inside the back cover, there was a small rectangle of paper folded in half. Not a note, not a list, but a sheet of graph paper with pencil notes made in a tiny, careful handwriting, the kind of script of someone who learned penmanship with attention and maintains it by habit even when no one is looking. The notes were a personal summary of a chapter on cognitive development in childhood. There were words rewritten with other words, like someone processing a new concept and needing to translate it into their own language so it truly sticks, so it becomes knowledge and not just memorized information. There were connections noted between one concept and another, arrows linking ideas in a reasoning that wasn't the book's, but that of the person who read the book and went further with it. And at the bottom of the page, in letters slightly larger than the rest, like a note made in a moment of clarity that needed to be recorded before it passed. Isabel is in this phase. It makes sense now. Edward stared at those words for a long time. 2 worlds he had never put in the same sentence before that moment, the daughter and the studies. Isabel had learned to read with the books from that library. He had intuited this the previous afternoon when the girl had mentioned the word architect with the precision of someone who hadn't pointed at a picture in a magazine, but read the definition in a text. The mother had learned to better understand her own daughter with those same books. And neither had left a trace that could be called an invasion, only the trace of those who passed with care and respect and love through a place that wasn't theirs, but which they needed. Edward sat in the reading chair near the window and stayed with the closed volume on his lap for a considerable time. Outside, the garden was dark except for the security lighting Benedict turned on every evening. The rose bushes in the east corner were dark blotches against a background of lightly illuminated grass, and there was a geometry in their arrangement that Benedict had planned over years with the intuition of someone who hadn't studied design but understood proportion. There was a kind of courage he hadn't learned to name in engineering school. It wasn't the courage of grand gestures, signing risky contracts, publicly defending an unpopular project, negotiating firmly with uncompromising suppliers. It was the smaller and infinitely more exhausting courage of continuing to want to grow when no one around is looking, when there is no structure supporting you, when every book you read in secret is an act of faith in a future version of yourself that you don't know for sure will ever exist. It's the courage to write in parentheses, on a resume that probably no one will take seriously, that your long-term goal is a degree, and not giving up on that even when the job you got with that resume is cleaning the house where the books of your dream are kept. He had spent 43 years admiring competence, in engineers, in managers, in business partners who knew what they were doing and had the history to prove it. He had recognized and rewarded that quality in dozens of professionals throughout his career without hesitation. And it had taken him 3 years to see, a few feet from his own desk, one of the most consistent and silent manifestations of that quality he had ever encountered in his life. Edward replaced the sheet of graph paper, exactly where he had found it, in the same fold at the same angle. He closed the volume with the care reserved for things that truly matter. He returned it to the shelf in the exactly correct position, this time with the attention that makes the difference between the right place and the memory of it. He went down the stairs. The dinner on the tray was cold. He ate it anyway, standing in the kitchen, looking through the window at the garden that wasn't visible from there, but which he knew was there, with the rose bushes in the east corner and the fungus Benedict had treated, and the geometry no one had asked for, but which existed nonetheless. There was a decision forming inside him with the slowness of structures built to last. It wasn't ready yet, but it was forming. On Tuesday morning, before leaving for the Manhattan office, Edward left a message with Christine for the administrative manager to communicate to Mary Stevens that Mr. Cavalcante needed to speak with her in the early afternoon upon his return from the external meeting. The message had been transmitted through administrative channels because that was how Edward operated. He didn't like direct communications that created expectation without context, preferring the discreet formality of a structured summons over the anxious impact of an improvised call on the spot. Christine had transmitted the message by phone at 10 in the morning. Mary had received it standing in the laundry area on the second floor, her hands still damp from rinsing bed linens, and had said, "All right, thank you," in a voice that let nothing leak out. After hanging up, she stood for a few seconds with the phone in her hand, looking at the soap bubbles that hadn't yet completely disappeared from the surface of the water in the basin. She had spent the weekend elaborating scenarios. It was a habit she had developed out of necessity. When the margin for error is small, anticipating possible outcomes is a way of not being caught completely by surprise. The most likely scenario she had built was a cordial but firm conversation in which the boss would make it clear with the politeness of someone who doesn't like scenes that the invasion of the private study by a child could not be repeated and that Isabel's access to the mansion needed to be reviewed. It was a reasonable outcome, and she had prepared a response that acknowledged the problem without over-apologizing, because she had learned that over-apologizing in a power relationship weakens more than it protects. What she hadn't built was any scenario in which the boss, the man who in 3 years had exchanged fewer than 50 sentences with her outside of the strictly professional realm, would call her to talk 2 days after the episode with a formality that wasn't punitive. At least it didn't seem punitive. But she didn't have enough reference to know for sure, and uncertainty, she had learned, was the most exhausting state that existed because it demanded you stay prepared for everything without being able to save energy for anything specific. Edward arrived at the mansion at 2:30 in the afternoon, a bit earlier than planned because the meeting had ended sooner than expected. Robert Drummond had agreed to the proposed margins, without the long negotiation that used to be his trademark, which was a victory that on any other Tuesday would have made Edward feel good for the rest of the day. He went straight to the study, left his briefcase on the desk, and picked up the internal phone. "Mary, please come to the study when you can." She was in the laundry room when the intercom rang. She took off her apron, checked that her uniform was in order with the kind of discreet quickness that doesn't draw attention, tucked a strand of hair that had escaped her bun during the last few hours of work, and walked down the hall with the measured steps of someone controlling their speed so as not to seem either rushed or reluctant, the two extremes that communicate more than any word. She knocked twice on the door. "Come in." The study was exactly as always, the desk with the projects, the bookshelves, the leather armchair by the window, the tray with the coffee Mrs. Lewis had left. Edward was standing behind the desk, his jacket removed and hanging on the rack next to the shelf, which was a slightly more informal version of the man she knew. He made a gesture toward the chair on the other side of the desk. "Sit." Mary sat with the straight posture of someone who doesn't allow themselves to sink into a seat that isn't theirs. Her hands stayed in her lap, still, because she had learned that hands give away what the face can hide, and at that moment, her hands needed to stay absolutely still. Edward stood for a moment, as if organizing the sequence of what he was going to say in the same way he organized the opening of an important presentation, with the awareness that the first words set the tone for everything that comes after. Then he pulled out his own chair and sat too, which placed both of them on the same horizontal plane for the first time since Mary had worked there. "I want to talk to you about the Cavalcante Development Scholarship Program." Mary waited. She didn't know what that meant and preferred not to fill the silence with assumptions that could be wrong. The company maintains a university scholarship program for staff development. Today, it is accessed mainly by engineers and managers who want to do postgraduate work or specialization in areas related to construction. But the program itself doesn't limit categories of employees by contract type. It's an open institutional policy. He made a brief pause, the kind that isn't empty but charged. I want to offer that access to you." The silence that followed had a duration Mary couldn't measure later, when she tried to reconstruct that moment. She heard the words. She processed the words individually. She recognized each of them as part of the vocabulary she knew. But the entire sentence, in that sequence, in that context, in that study, wasn't fitting with the normal speed of daily processing. "To me," she repeated. It wasn't a question, it was a verification. The gesture of someone needing to confirm they understood the language correctly before responding in kind. "To you." Edward kept his tone direct, without the inflection people use when they are being condescending and try to hide it with kindness. "I learned that your goal since before you started here was to study psychology. Is that still true?" Mary's stomach tightened in a way she hadn't felt in a long time, the specific contraction of someone caught in a truth they kept carefully and suddenly realizing the compartment was no longer as airtight as they thought. For an instant, her first reaction was to ask how he knew, but the answer appeared immediately afterward, too obvious to need investigation. The resume. She had written that 3 years ago, in that line in parentheses, with the discreet honesty of someone who didn't want to lie but also didn't want to overexpose. And she had forgotten, or tried to forget, that documents keep what people said before they learn to be careful with what they reveal. "It still is," she said. Her voice was firmer than she had expected it to be. Edward nodded with the gravity of someone recording important information. "The program covers 50% of tuition at partner institutions. The list includes 3 universities with evening courses in Stamford and Norwalk, with access by public transport from Greenwich." A pause. "You would need to cover the remaining amount, but with your current salary and the installment options the universities offer, it's viable. Christine can help you look at the numbers if you want." Mary looked at her hands in her lap for a moment. There was a practical, immediate thing she needed to say before anything else, before the gratitude she hadn't yet processed, before the incredulity still trying to turn into something more useful. "Mr. Cavalcante." Her voice was controlled, but there was something in it that required a lot of effort to stay that way. "I thank you so much, truly. But the evening classes—" She looked up and held his gaze because looking into the eyes of someone offering you something is the minimum dignity one can preserve. "Isabel would leave daycare at 5:30. Mrs. Harrison, my neighbor, can't stay with her past 7:30 at night, and classes end at 10:30. A 2-second pause. "I have no one to leave my daughter with during that time." Edward had anticipated this point. He had thought about it the evening before, in the reading chair in the library, with the psychology volume closed on his lap and the dark garden outside. He had thought about it with the same method he used for project obstacles. Identify the problem, map the variables, find the solution that keeps the project moving. "I know," he said. "On class nights I'll stay with Isabel." The silence this time was of a completely different nature than all the other silences that afternoon. Mary stared at him with an expression that wasn't doubt. It was that of someone checking if she had correctly understood the language the sentence had been spoken in, if the context was what it seemed to be, if the man in front of her had indeed said what she had just heard. "You—" she began and stopped. "3 nights a week," Edward said, in the same voice as someone announcing a contract clause that had been carefully thought out and was not open for renegotiation because it was simply the most logical. "While you're at university, I'll look after the girl here. She stays with me until you get back." Mary opened her mouth and closed it. It was the first time in 3 years that her control mechanism had failed so visibly. Not from anger, not from hurt, but from something different rising from her chest with a speed that caught her completely off guard. It was the kind of thing you keep in a very closed place because you know the world rarely opens that door, and when someone does, the impact is proportional to the time the door stayed shut. She stood up from the chair. Not because she was leaving, but because she needed a second on her feet to hold what was happening. She faced the window overlooking the garden, her back to Edward for exactly 3 seconds. When she turned around, her face was dry and her voice was firm, because she had learned that some forms of gratitude are too large to be expressed in an office where you still need to work tomorrow morning. "I need to think," she said. "Of course." Edward stood up too. "There's no rush at all. When you have an answer, let me know." She went to the door, put her hand on the knob and stopped. She didn't turn around completely, just enough for the profile of her face to be visible against the afternoon light coming through the shutter. Why? The question was small and direct and carried everything she hadn't said before. Edward looked at her for a moment before answering. There was more than one true answer to that question. There was the answer that fit in an office and the one that didn't fit yet. He chose the one that was true without being more than could be said at that moment. Because a person with the will to grow deserves the chance to do so. Mary left the study. She closed the door with the same care as always, the care of someone who respects places even when the places don't know they are being respected. In the marble hallway this time, she needed 5 seconds before moving on. 5 long, silent seconds, with her back against the cold wall, eyes fixed on the white ceiling, and something in her chest that was still trying to find the right name for itself. Then she moved on. The laundry was waiting, the bed linens were waiting, the rest of the day was waiting with the regularity of everything that doesn't know what just changed. But Mary knew. And that was one of the few things in the world that didn't need to be said out loud to be completely real. Mary had taken 2 days to give her answer. Not because of hesitation about the scholarship, that part had been immediately clear, with that clarity that true opportunities have when they appear, different from the clarity of traps because it asks for nothing in return that you aren't willing to give. The delay had been for the other part, for the proposal of Edward taking care of Isabel. There was something in that offer she needed time to process. Not because she doubted its sincerity, but because accepting it meant entering into a type of relationship with the boss that was different from everything it had been until then. And different types of relationships require different types of trust. And trust for Mary was not something distributed without due attention. On Thursday afternoon, she knocked on the study door. "I accept," she said, "both parts." Edward looked up from the documents and nodded with the brevity of someone confirming a decision that had been made before it was spoken. "When do you want to start looking for a university?" "I've already looked. Fairfield University has an entrance process next month. They have spots in the evening for psychology, something that wasn't exactly a smile, but had the same temperature passed across Edward's face for a fraction of a second. "Talk to Christine about the scholarship process. She knows what needs to be done." Mary left the study with the same posture as always, but her steps in the marble hallway were, for some reason she herself couldn't explain, 2 grams lighter than they had been on the way in. The first night happened 3 weeks later, on a Monday in April, when Isabel arrived at the mansion with her daycare backpack still on her back, and the wide eyes of a child who knows something different is going to happen, but doesn't yet know exactly what. Mary had explained to her daughter with the simplicity the situation deserved. "Mommy is going to study at night, and Mr. Edward is going to stay with you here until she gets back." Isabel had received the information with that pragmatic serenity of children who haven't yet learned that certain combinations of people are improbable. "Is he going to teach me about architecture?" "Maybe you can ask him." Other than that, no ceremony, no visible anxiety. 6 years old is an age when the world still seems malleable enough to include new possibilities without the inclusion needing to be justified by anyone. Edward had asked Mrs. Lewis to prepare a simple dinner for 2, pasta marinara with grilled chicken, because he had discreetly asked Mary what the girl liked to eat, and Mary had said pasta with the speed of someone who doesn't need to think to answer, because it's the answer every Monday. Mrs. Lewis had prepared it and left it on the kitchen table with the 2 plates placed side by side, which was a configuration she had never made before in those 12 years, as the boss always dined alone at the big table or standing in the kitchen, depending on the mood of the day. When Mary left at 6:50, with her new notebooks in her bag and the most serious clothes she had for an occasion, she didn't quite know how to classify yet. Edward and Isabel were sitting across from each other at the kitchen table, plates in front of them. Isabel was explaining with extreme seriousness the difference between spaghetti and rotini, which according to her were completely different, despite being similar because one slips and the other holds the sauce. Edward listened to her with the same attention he gave to project presentations. That, Mary saw from the door before leaving, was the strangest and most unexpected thing of everything that had happened in those weeks. On that first night after dinner, Edward opened the study desk drawer and took out his collector's pen case. Italian resin pieces he had bought over the years at specialty fairs and which never left the drawer except to sign important documents. Isabel had looked at the pens with the wide eyes of someone before something belonging to a category above the everyday. "Are these special?" "They are." "Can I hold one?" Edward took the simplest one from the case, a blue resin fountain pen he had bought at a bookstore in Philadelphia 10 years ago, and placed it in her hand with the care of someone handing over something of value. Not the value measured in dollars, but the other kind. Carefully, Isabel held it with both hands, looked at the gold nib and asked if she could write something. Edward pulled a piece of stationery from the drawer and said yes. She wrote her own name, slowly, with her tongue sticking out of her mouth in a sign of maximum concentration, and then looked at the result with the satisfaction of someone who had just signed an important document for the first time in their life. "It looks pretty." "It does," he agreed, and it was true. After the pens came the addition. Edward had discovered on that first night that Isabel was still learning to add numbers above 10, and that there was a specific point, 12 plus 8, where she always erred by 1 and got slightly frustrated with herself before trying again. He had created a system with the caps of the pens from the case, using them as physical markers on the desk, and after 15 minutes, the 12 plus 8 sum had become Isabel's favorite because it was the one she had conquered with the Italian pens, which was a form of conquest with a witness. When Mary returned at 11:10, with the shining eyes of someone who had spent 3 hours absorbing new things, and a head full of a kind of exhaustion that has a different flavor from the exhaustion of physical work, she found Isabel sleeping on the living room sofa with a folded blanket over her. The pen case had been carefully closed and placed on the cushion beside her, like a treasure kept close during sleep. Edward was in the nearby armchair, reading a report with his glasses on. He looked up when she entered. "She fell asleep half an hour ago," he said in a low voice. "She knows 12 plus 8 by heart now." Mary looked at her sleeping daughter and then at the man in the armchair, and there was in that specific angle the lamplight, the folded blanket, the pen case in the place of honor, an image she hadn't planned to find and didn't yet know where to put inside herself. It was an image that didn't fit the categories she had carefully built over the years to know where everything belonged. "How was the class?" he asked. It was the first time anyone had asked that. Not just that night. In her entire adult life, counting all the jobs and all the ends of the day, she had arrived home with some new learning kept inside her. It was the first time someone had waited for her to arrive and asked how it had been. "It was good," she said in a voice smaller than she intended. "It was very good." Edward nodded and went back to the report. Mary picked up Isabel carefully so as not to wake her. The girl weighed more than she seemed, that was always the thought, as if sleep added gravity to children, and went to the room that had been prepared for them to stay in on class nights. In the hallway, before turning the corner, she turned around one last time. Edward was still in the armchair with the report, but the pen case had moved on the side table. It had been moved closer to the edge, as if someone wanted it to remain visible even after its temporary owner had been taken to bed. Mary went to the room, and for the first time in a long time, the exhaustion that accompanied her at bedtime had no color of worry. 3 nights a week, the new architecture of the mansion established itself with the solidity of things that start out improbable and end up inevitable. The gardener Benedict declared to Mrs. Lewis, with the quiet conviction of someone who had observed much over many years, that there was a difference in the mansion that wasn't about the size of what changed, but the weight. Mrs. Lewis agreed without needing an explanation, because some differences are felt before they are understood, and the understanding in this case would come with time. The weeks that followed created a new architecture in the daily life of the mansion, and architectures, Edward knew better than anyone, are never just functional. They change how people move within a space, the angle at which light falls, the weight of the air at certain times of day. Robert Drummond was the first to notice. He was a 50-year-old man with the sharp intuition of someone who had worked for 2 decades alongside a partner whose patterns he knew as his own, and there was something different about the Edward of the last few weeks that he couldn't precisely classify. In meetings he remained sharp and decisive. The quality of the work hadn't changed at all, but there was a kind of different haste in the final hours of the day, a lightness that wasn't distraction, but a presence of another kind, as if there were a specific place toward which he was always discreetly oriented. "Do you have a fixed commitment at 6:30 now?" Robert had asked one Wednesday, with the direct curiosity that old partners allow themselves. "I do," Edward had replied without elaborating. Robert had looked at him for a second longer than necessary, then returned to the documents, with the discreet smile of someone who decided they didn't need to understand everything to recognize that something was moving in the right direction. An investor from a fund in Chicago, who had visited the central office during that period, had asked the question more directly, with the frankness of someone who doesn't know the local courtesies. "You seem different from the businessman I met a year ago. What changed?" Edward had replied that he was building something more lasting than concrete. The investor had noted that in his notebook with the face of someone who didn't completely understand but suspected it was important. It was. In early May on a Saturday, when Mary had stayed at the mansion for a larger job, and Isabel had come along because it was easier, the cook heard from the pantry the sound of a conversation coming from the study. It wasn't uncommon for Edward to receive people in the study on a Saturday, but the tone was different. There was a small voice mixed with his, a voice that asked questions without stopping in the interval between explanations. Mary had heard it too. She had stopped in the hallway and looked through the half-open door. Edward and Isabel were leaned over the desk with a large sheet of paper between them. Edward had drawn with the collector's pens the simplified sketch of a floor plan: 4 rooms, a central hallway, windows marked with squares, stairs indicated by an arrow. Isabel pointed to each part with her finger, while he explained with the patience of someone who found, without looking, the best possible use for knowledge he had had for 20 years. "This is Mommy's room, this is mine. This one here is for receiving visitors. And this one? This is the library." A pause. "Every good house has one." Isabel had processed that with the seriousness of an architect in training. "Is ours going to have a big library?" "When you build it, it will be whatever size you want." Mary stood in the doorway for a few seconds, without either of them noticing. There was in that image the man leaning over the paper and the girl standing on tiptoes to reach better, the Italian pens scattered between the two, with the casualness of things that had been private and became shared, something she hadn't planned to feel and felt anyway, with the silent intensity of things that don't ask permission to happen. She took a step back before anyone turned. She went to the kitchen. She made coffee. She heard from afar Isabel's voice explain to Edward that her house's library was going to have a big window to let the morning sun in, because books like sun. That night, after Isabel went to sleep, Mary was washing the cups in the kitchen when she heard footsteps in the entrance. Edward stopped in the kitchen doorway with the naturalness of someone learning the shortcuts of a space they previously traversed only in straight lines. "Want coffee?" she asked without turning around. "No need to make any. It's already made." He came in and sat on one of the stools at the counter. It was the first time she had seen that, Edward sitting on a kitchen stool, without a jacket, without the professional context he carried like a second skin in all other rooms. There was something slightly different in his configuration in that space, like a piece of wooden furniture finally placed in the right environment, where the scale makes sense. Mary placed the 2 cups on the counter and leaned on the other side. "How are the classes?" he asked. "The developmental psychology professor spoke today about attachment bonds." She made a pause. "About how a child learns to trust the world through the first bonds they form, about what happens when those bonds are solid." Edward looked at the cup. "And when they aren't? The person spends years trying to build on their own what should have been given." Mary said that looking at her own coffee, and there was a precision in the sentence that came from a place too personal to be just theoretical. "But they succeed," she added later, "with more effort than necessary, but they succeed." There was a silence that wasn't empty. It was the silence of 2 people understanding something at the same time, without needing to name what it was. "Isabel won't have that problem," Edward said finally. It wasn't a question or a formal promise. It was an observation with the weight of things said with awareness of what they mean. Mary looked up and found him looking at her with an expression she had seen once before. In the study, the afternoon she had walked out the door and asked why. The expression of someone who has more than one true answer, and is choosing carefully which one can be said yet. She won't, she agreed. Edward drank the coffee, placed the cup on the counter and looked at her for a moment longer. You know you're the bravest person I've ever met, he said. It wasn't a compliment in the sense of the compliments people exchange at social events. It was an observation, one of those that arrive suddenly, without packaging, because they were thought about long enough to dispense with ornament. Mary was silent for a second. Then she responded with the honesty of someone caught off guard, but who wasn't going to pretend she hadn't heard. It's not courage. It's just not having had the option to be anything else. Edward shook his head slightly. It's not the same as not having an option. I know people who didn't have an option and were something else anyway. You chose even when you had no choice. That's different. Mary looked at him for a moment with the attention she reserved for things that needed to be kept carefully. Then she went to bed, her heart a little fuller than it had been in a long time, and with the specific feeling, rare, delicate, which she was still learning to recognize without suspicion, that she was being seen truly by someone who knew what they were looking at. In the garden Mr. Benedict had planted that week a second row of yellow rose bushes in the east corner, where the fungus had been. He hadn't asked if he should, he had just planted them, because he had understood gardens long enough to know that when something survives a plague and stays standing, the right thing is to give it more room to grow. The crisis arrived on a Tuesday in June, in the silent and devastating way real crises usually arrive. Not with sirens or announcements, but with a phone call Robert Drummond made at 7:46, when Isabel was finishing coloring a floor plan she had drawn on Edward's scrap paper, and Edward himself was genuinely watching her use the color orange to indicate all the areas where the sun should enter, which in practice included almost every room. The phone vibrated on the desk. Edward looked at the name on the screen and felt something, a minimal change in the air quality, the kind of thing an engineer who understands structures recognizes before seeing the problem, when the project still seems intact, but something in the assembly is not responding as it should. Wait a second, he said to Isabel. He went out to the hallway. Robert spoke for 4 minutes without long pauses, which was already a symptom of gravity. Robert was a man of calculated speech and strategic pauses, and when the pauses disappeared, it was because the situation had accelerated beyond the control of the usual rhythm. What he narrated, with the flat voice of someone still processing while informing, was this. A set of technical reports had circulated among the main investment funds of Cavalcante Developments that afternoon, accompanied by an anonymous letter presenting them as internal documents of the construction firm. The reports pointed to serious irregularities in 4 land parcels, acquired in the last 2 years, supposedly ignored preservation areas, supposedly forged license documentation. 2 funds had already requested a suspension of pending contributions. A third had asked for an emergency meeting for the following week. Edward was silent for a second after Robert finished. The reports are fake, he said. It wasn't a guess. It was the certainty of someone who knew every piece of land in his company with the intimacy of someone who chose and approved them personally. I know they are, but we need to prove that before 2 more funds pull out. If the 3 big ones leave together, we don't have coverage for the September commitments. I know. A pause. Call Markin Legal right now, gather everything you have on the 4 parcels and send it to my email by early tomorrow morning. He hung up. He stood in the hallway for exactly 3 seconds. The time he had learned over the years was the minimum necessary to reorganize his expression before returning to an environment where someone was waiting. Then he went back to the study. Isabel had finished coloring and held up the sheet for him to see the result. The orange had spread generously across the entire east facade of the plan, including the kitchen and one of the bedrooms that only received sun in the afternoon, which from a technical point of view was inaccurate, but from the point of view of the child who drew it was completely intentional. "Is it good?" she asked. "It's very good," he said with a voice that was true within one context and controlled within the other at the same time. When Mary arrived that night, at 11:10, Edward was not in the armchair with the report as had become a habit. He was in the garden, standing near the yellow rose bushes in the east corner, phone in hand, and his gaze turned toward the distant city lights appearing above the walls of the gated community, like an irregular constellation, drawn by someone who doesn't know geometry but understands light. Mary saw him through the living room window before entering. There was something in the position of that body, the spine slightly curved forward, the weight distributed differently than usual, the hand holding the phone with more force than the object required, that she recognized not by logic but by sensation, the way one recognizes rain before it starts by the smell the air takes on when nothing has fallen yet. She went to the bedroom, laid down Isabel, who had fallen asleep in her arms during the way back, and returned to the living room. Through the window glass, Edward was still in the garden. She didn't go to him. She hadn't been invited into that specific wait, and she had learned that there are types of burdens people need to carry alone for at least a while before being able to share them. But she stood at the window for a few minutes, notebook still in her bag, looking at the figure in the garden who seemed, for the first time since she worked in that house, smaller than the space around him. That night was the first in which she did not fall asleep with the kind of exhaustion that tastes of achievement. She fell asleep with the kind that tastes of worry, and there was a difference between the two she recognized precisely because she had experienced both throughout her entire life. In the following days, the mansion breathed differently. Edward left earlier and arrived later. Meetings multiplied. Robert Drummond began calling at least 3 times a day. Christine Miller had come personally to the mansion one afternoon to bring documents that needed urgent signatures. The 2-plate dinner Mrs. Lewis had grown accustomed to preparing returned to one, because Edward hadn't arrived in time on the first 2 nights of that week, and had called Mary with a very brief voice, apologizing with the seriousness of someone who knows that absence has weight beyond the cold dinner. Isabel had heard the conversation from the corner and asked afterward, with the frankness she reserved for the questions adults usually deflect. "Is Edward sad? He's having a problem at work, Belle. But he'll solve it." It was a statement, not a question, said with the simple confidence of someone who hasn't yet learned that not all problems are solved with intelligence and determination, and that this specific ignorance is perhaps the most generous gift childhood offers. He's smart. Mary had looked at her daughter for a moment, with that mix of love and admiration children provoke when they say the right thing without knowing exactly what they are doing. Yes, she had agreed, he is. But there was something Isabel's simple faith didn't reach. Something Mary had begun to notice on the margins of what she saw and heard in those days, with the kind of attention developed when one spends years learning to read environments before being read by them. A name had appeared twice in different contexts. The first time in the hallway, when Robert and Edward had passed in accelerated conversation, and she had caught the fragment, "Menezes isn't going to stop at that," said with the specific tone of someone stating a fact and not lamenting it. The second time in a document that had been left on the kitchen counter for a few minutes before someone remembered it was there, a legal paper where the name Frank Menezes appeared in the header, along with the words "contested reports" and "documentary challenge." She had put the paper back where it was and continued her work with the naturalness of someone who saw nothing relevant. But the name had stayed, archived in an internal place she had learned to use with parsimony and care, because she knew some information is only worth something when you know the right moment to use it, and the right moment is rarely the same moment it appears. Mr. Benedict, who had seen many seasons in that garden and had learned that yellow rose bushes were the most resistant because they grow slowly, remained silent in those days while tending the plants. But one afternoon, while pruning the side branches with his usual shears, he said to no one in particular, like someone making an observation about the weather, "A plant that was attacked and survived grows stronger than one that never was." He made a calculated pause. "That goes for gardens, and it goes for other things too." Mary had passed by at that moment and heard him. She hadn't responded. But she had kept it too, with the care of someone who knows that the words of wise old men rarely arrive before the right hour. July arrived with the dry heat that New York accumulates between summer rains and late winter dryness. And Cavalcante Developments entered that month with its structure pressured like a beam subjected to a load at the limit of what the project had envisioned. The 2 funds that had suspended contributions hadn't backed down. The third had held the emergency meeting and emerged from it in a waiting position that was, in practice, a gradual withdrawal disguised as caution. Robert Drummond had hired a specialized firm for forensic document analysis to prove the forgery of the reports, and work was advancing. but advancing with the slowness technical processes have when the pressure from the outside is greater than the speed on the inside. Edward had explained the situation to Mary one night when Isabel was sleeping and the two of them were in the kitchen, both with coffee, the window open to the cool garden. He had explained with the objectivity of someone reporting an engineering problem, the forces at play, the pressure points, the variables that were still open. He had said the name Frank Menezes without elaborating more than necessary, a former partner who had been removed from the company 2 years earlier after an internal audit found serious irregularities in the management of contracts under his supervision. The exit had been negotiated in terms that neither had chosen freely, and which Menezes clearly had not accepted, with the resignation the agreement intended. Mary had listened without interrupting. She had asked 2 practical questions at the end. Does the company have enough reserves for the next 90 days? And does the staff know what is happening? Edward had looked at her with that specific attention she had begun to identify as the look he used when someone said something he wasn't expecting to receive. It does. The staff knows enough not to panic. Then you have time to prove what you need to prove. It wasn't a question or a prophecy. It was an observation from someone who had spent years calculating narrow margins and knew that when there is time and there is fact, the truth eventually finds its way out, because the truth doesn't need to be invented, only evidenced. What Mary hadn't said that night was that she had already begun to think. Not abstractly, concretely, with that method she applied to every problem she needed to solve with limited resources. Identify what you have, map what can be used, act at the moment the action has the most effect. The name Frank Menezes had made a second appearance even before the conversation with Edward. Not at the mansion, but in the hallway, near the third-floor bathroom at the university in Fairfield, where 2 law students had talked loudly enough to be heard by passers-by, about a case of contesting forensic reports in a business dispute that had been discussed in their ethics class. Mary had caught the details with the trained hearing of someone who always paid attention to what people say when they think no one of importance is listening, because she had learned early on that most information that matters arrives through that channel. But there was something else, something that existed since before the university hallways, and that had been kept without her knowing yet what it was for, which is often how the most important things stay kept. There was a woman who frequented the coffee shop near the Fairfield campus, where Mary stopped every class night to have a coffee before the transport back. A woman of about 40, with chin-length hair, always with a burgundy leather bag and a hard-bound notebook on the table. They had greeted each other for the first time in the second week of classes, when both had arrived at the counter at the same time, and the woman had gently insisted Mary go first. They had exchanged names, Tanya, Mary, and nothing more for that night. The following week, they had sat at the same table for lack of another available, and the conversation had developed with the naturalness of conversations between women who have no reason to suspect each other and share the specific type of exhaustion that unites more than any common interest. Work, routine, the coffee that was stronger than usual that day. Tanya had said she was a secretary in a business consulting firm. She had said it with a specific exhaustion Mary recognized precisely. The exhaustion of someone who works hard for someone who doesn't deserve the effort and has known that long enough for the knowing to hurt, but not yet long enough to have decided what to do with it. In the 3rd week, Tanya hadn't appeared, but in the 4th she had returned with a different look, more closed with a worry she tried to cover with her usual politeness without completely succeeding. Mary had reached that point in her thoughts and had stopped to verify what she was considering. It was delicate, not in the sense of risky, but in the sense of human. It would involve a woman she barely knew, a situation she didn't control, and a trust that would need to be built with real care to not break anyone in the process. The psychology classes had taught a lot about how people decide to open up, about what makes them trust and what closes them, about the difference between manipulation and genuine connection, and she had learned because she wanted to understand people, not because she wanted to use them. This distinction was important. It was the distinction that made what she was thinking of doing something she could do while looking in her own eyes in the mirror afterward. There was a company at risk. There were hundreds of families linked to that company through jobs, contracts, and projects in progress. There was a daughter who learned addition with Italian pens and drew floor plans with orange windows. And there was a man who had opened a door when he could have perfectly kept it closed, and who was now standing in a garden at 11 at night, looking at the lights of a city he had helped build, and that was being used against him. Mary went to sleep that night with the decision not yet fully formed, but closer to being so than it had been the night before. And she had learned over the years that sometimes that's how the most important things form, not in a single moment of dramatic clarity, but in a series of nights in which you sleep a little more convinced than you woke up, until the morning arrives when you know. The next morning, she asked Edward if she could leave half an hour earlier on the next class night of the week. He said yes without asking why, and that absence of a question, she realized, was the most concrete form of trust he had shown so far. She went to the coffee shop half an hour before the usual time. Tanya was there with the burgundy leather bag and the hardbound notebook and the same closed look as the last time they had seen each other. Mary ordered a coffee, went to the table, and sat down. And this time she didn't wait for the other to start. "So you look like you're carrying something heavy," she said. Simple, direct, without the theater of compassion people use when interest is behind the worry. Tanya looked at her for a moment, and something in her face very slightly began to yield. Tanya said nothing immediately. She looked at her coffee for a moment, with the expression of someone checking internally if she could trust what she was feeling, if the opening she felt like making was safe, or if it was just exhaustion speaking louder than caution. Mary didn't fill the silence. She had learned in theory what she had learned in practice before, that people open up to those who know how to wait at the right moment, not to those who push before the hour. Genuinely waiting is different from strategically waiting, and people perceive the difference with a precision that doesn't pass through conscious reasoning. "Have you ever had to do something you didn't quite understand at the time?" Tanya began. It wasn't the question Mary had expected, but it was a door. "Many times," Mary responded honestly. "And later, when you understood, was it too late to undo?" "That too." Tanya looked up. "And what did you do?" "I tried to do what was possible within what was left, which isn't always much, but it's usually something." The silence that followed was of a different type than the previous one. Not the silence of someone deciding whether to open up, but the silence of someone who already has and is evaluating what to put first. Mary remained quiet, coffee in hand, with no visible hurry. Tanya spoke for 40 minutes. Not in a straight line. She went in the spiral that narratives loaded with guilt usually have, returning to certain moments, re-explaining certain details, testing if the weight remained the same after being put into words. What she narrated without mentioning names on the first night was the texture, instructions received without full explanation, documents prepared to be sent to recipients she didn't know, a boss with the specific skill of making wrong things seem procedurally correct while they were being done. Mary listened to everything without interrupting, without judging, without the anxiety of someone waiting for specific information and therefore unable to really hear what was being said. There was a difference between listening and waiting for someone to finish speaking, and that difference was the first thing the psychology professor had taught on the first day of class, and which she had recognized immediately because she had been practicing it for years without having the technical name for what she did. When Tanya finished, Mary said only, "That weighs a lot." "It does," the other confirmed, "but I don't know what to do with it." "You don't need to know yet." There was a second night, a week later. Tanya had arrived before Mary, which was a change. In previous weeks she had arrived during, like someone appearing without prior commitment to be able to leave without owing anything. Arriving before was another kind of gesture. On that second night, Tanya said the name Frank Menezes for the first time. She said it with the flat tone of someone who had already resolved internally that there was no sense in protecting someone who never bothered to deserve the protection. She said what she had done, what he had asked her to do, and why she had complied. Because she had been working there for years, because she needed the job, because she had arrived too late to the point where an honorable exit was possible without cost. And then she had passed that point, and the exit had become complicated in a way that paralyzed her. Mary heard everything. And then she said the thing psychology had taught that people most need to hear before being able to act. You didn't choose this. You were put in this situation. That's different. Tanya opened her mouth and closed it, and there was in her eyes something Mary had learned to recognize in class, not by the technical name, but by the substance. The expression of someone who wants to do the right thing and is looking for the permission she doesn't know who to ask for, because the permission that comes from within hasn't arrived yet. On a third night, 10 days later, Tanya arrived at the coffee shop with her burgundy leather bag heavier than usual, and the look of someone who had made a decision during the week and came there to see if she still believed in it up close, in the real weight of things, and not just in the version that exists in the silence of her own room. They ordered the usual coffee. Tanya opened her bag and took out a sealed manila envelope. She placed it on the table between the two cups with the delicacy of someone depositing something that had weighed heavily for a long time. "These are the original emails," she said. "The ones showing the reports were externally commissioned by him, with dates, with amounts, with the names of those who received payment to fabricate them. I kept them because I didn't know why at the time." A pause. "Now I know." Mary looked at the envelope, then at Tanya. "You're going to be okay," she said. It wasn't a prediction. It was a commitment of the kind made with the seriousness of someone who knows words create responsibility. What you're doing is right, and that matters, regardless of what happens next. Tanya nodded once, with the brief firmness of someone who needed only that confirmation to hold on to what she had decided. She stood up, paid for the coffee, and left with her bag lighter than when she had arrived. Mary stayed at the table for a few more minutes with the envelope before her. The coffee had grown cold. The shop was less full than it had been an hour before. She placed the envelope carefully inside her notebook bag, paid, and left for the transport back. Edward was in the armchair when she arrived. He had returned earlier that night, which was rare in that difficult period, and there was in the texture of the silence around him the quality of someone who arrived too exhausted to go to bed, but who no longer had anything to do but wait for tomorrow to bring something different from today. Isabel was sleeping in the bedroom. Mary stopped in the center of the room and took the envelope from her bag. She placed it on the coffee table without saying anything. Edward looked at the envelope, then at her. There was a question in his look that he didn't ask out loud. "These are the emails proving the reports were fabricated," she said, with the serenity of someone who had prepared that sentence but didn't need to rehearse it. "With complete documentation. You'll need legal to analyze it before any move, but everything is there." The silence that followed had a quality she hadn't felt before in that house. It was the silence of when a structure about to give way finds the support it lacked, and the noise that wasn't there because the collapse didn't happen was heavier than any sound. Edward stared at the envelope for a time he couldn't measure. Then he looked up at her, and there was in that face something she had seen few times in other people, and never in that specific man. The expression of someone before something they don't know how to thank, because the size of the gratitude is larger than any word available for it. Then, in a voice that was the quietest she had heard coming from him, he asked how she had gotten it. "Listening," she responded, "with attention and with respect for the person who chose to trust." Edward looked at her for a moment longer. And then something happened that Mrs. Lewis's 12 years in the mansion and Mr. Benedict's 10 years in the garden had never witnessed. Edward Cavalcante closed his eyes for 2 seconds, and when he opened them, they were damp, not from weakness but in the way eyes become when a pressure that was dammed up finally finds the exit it deserved. The following week was one of quick and certain movement. The legal team presented the documents to the competent authorities with the security of those who have proof and don't need speculation. The reports were fully discredited before the investment funds, which received the complete documentation with due attention. Contributions were resumed. Frank Menezes answered for damages in all available civil and commercial spheres, and saw his name removed from the records of the main associations in the construction sector of the state, the kind of consequence that doesn't make noise in the news but which, in the market where he had tried to operate, meant the end of any possibility of repeating what he had tried to do. Cavalcante Developments not only survived, but closed the next quarter with the largest contracts in its history. The signal the market sends when it recognizes that a company resisted pressure with transparency, and emerged on the other side with its structure intact. In the garden, on an August night with a sky cleaner than usual for Connecticut, Mr. Benedict opened the gate and entered, carrying a new yellow rosebush sapling he had ordered from a nursery in Long Island. Mrs. Lewis had prepared a long dinner with dessert, and the table was set in the garden for the entire mansion staff. Edward had insisted everyone stay. Isabel had helped fold the napkins with the concentration of someone fulfilling an important function in a celebration she didn't completely understand, but for which her whole body said yes. That night, under the August stars, the mansion that had for years been a space of cold excellence breathed for the first time with the full warmth of a place where people matter as much as the projects they build. The Saturday in September arrived with the morning sun that New York saves for days when it doesn't live up to its reputation as a difficult city, a clean and golden sun that came from the east and hit the mansion windows with the honesty of mornings that don't need any argument to justify their own beauty. Edward had woken up early, as always, but had done something different. He had stayed sitting on the edge of the bed for 15 minutes without picking up his phone or tablet, just sitting with his feet on the sisal rug and the morning light coming through the crack in the shutters, thinking with the specific clarity of thoughts that had already been thought many times and finally reached the right form, the form in which an idea stops being an idea and starts being a decision. There was a folder on the dresser. He had prepared it the night before, with the attention he gave to important project folders, documents in the right order, nothing missing, nothing extra, each page in the place that made sense for whoever was going to read it. He went down at 7:30. Mrs. Lewis hadn't arrived yet. It was too early for a Saturday. Edward made his own coffee, which he did rarely, and which always produced a technically correct result, but without the precision of someone who knows that coffee is as much an act of affection as a drink. Mary arrived at 8 with Isabel, who entered through the front door in her pink Velcro sandals. Still the same ones from the first day, with the left strap's Velcro still slightly crooked, because she categorically refused to let anyone adjust what she understood to be a characteristic and not a defect, and went directly to the kitchen to ask if there were scones. "They're in the cupboard," Edward said, "but I need both of you to come with me to a place first." Isabel looked at him with the seriousness of someone who evaluates proposals before accepting anything. "With scones? You can bring them." The Overlook was 20 minutes away by car, at a high point on the outer perimeter of Greenwich, where the trees opened up to a view that embraced a good part of the New York metropolitan area, an infinite wave of concrete and green and light that on that September morning had an almost unreal quality of sharpness. Edward had discovered that place years before, on an afternoon when he had left a difficult meeting and simply driven without a destination until the car had stopped there and the city below had seemed, for the first time in a long time, a place where it was possible to build something worthwhile. They got out of the car. Isabel ran to the guardrail and looked down with the wide eyes of a child who hasn't yet learned to pretend she's used to big things. "You can see everything!" she shouted. "Almost everything," Edward confirmed. Mary stood beside him, her hand on the rail, looking at the horizon, with the tranquil expression he had learned to read, her expression when she was completely present, without the layer of calculation and anticipation she used in moments of uncertainty. It was the most honest expression she had, and there was a time when he didn't know it existed, because he only saw it when he stopped, not looking. Edward took the folder he had brought. He called Isabel. The girl approached with the scones still in her hand. Looking at the folder with the diagnostic curiosity she applied to all unknown adult objects. "What's that?" Edward knelt down to her level. It was a gesture he had learned in the early weeks, that talking to Isabel while standing was like trying a negotiation with the table between the two. It worked, but it lost something that didn't have a name, but had weight. On his knees, on the same plane, the subject had another quality entirely. "Do you remember what you told me when you walked into my study for the first time?" Isabel thought for a second with her tongue at the corner of her mouth, which was the sign of concentrated effort. "That you had a lot of papers?" Before that, say pause for processing. And then the recognition in her look, that specific shine that appears when a memory that was kept finds the right question to open. "That you were my daddy." Edward nodded slowly. "Yes. and I said I didn't know what that word meant to me yet. But I learned. He opened the folder and took out the documents, the adoption process pages, with her name and his name printed side by side on paper that had the specific weight of things that exist to last beyond the moment they were created. These papers say that I want to be your daddy for real, not just because you said it, but because I chose it, before the law, forever. Isabel looked at the papers, then at him, then at the papers again with the attention of someone checking that what she sees corresponds to what she heard. You're going to be my daddy for real? If you want. What came next happened with the speed and force only 6-year-olds have when the heart and body decide the same thing at the same time. Isabel jumped with both feet off the ground and landed in Edward's arms with an impulse that made both of them step back 2 paces and then lose their balance in a completely inevitable and perfectly satisfying way, falling together onto the overlook's grass, with the scone rolling to one side and the documents flying slightly to the other, and both laughing with the specific laugh of someone who fell and has no intention of getting up yet because the ground is all so good. Mary stood looking at that scene with her hands over her mouth and eyes full of the kind of thing that has no precise name, but which all people who love someone with enough intensity recognize when they see it, because they've already felt it, or because they always knew it would be like that when it arrived. Edward stood up from the grass with grass on the knees of his trousers and his hair slightly disheveled for the first time in years she could remember. He picked up the documents from the ground with care. He went to Mary. He took her hands in his there, standing on the overlook with the entire city below as a silent and generous witness. You saved my company, he said. You saved my sanity. You and Isabel saved something in me that I didn't even know needed to be saved, and which, if it hadn't been, I would never have known what was missing. A pause. I'm not asking you to be my employee. I'm asking you to be my partner, as equals, a real family. Mary looked at him for a moment, with that expression he had seen a few times, the expression of someone checking if she had correctly understood the language in which the sentence was spoken, if the context was what it seemed to be. This time, the check lasted only a second. Yes, she said. And Isabel, who had heard everything from the grass where she was still lying looking at the clouds with the reunified scone in her hand, shouted a solidary yes of confirmation that echoed through the overlook and made a pair of pigeons take flight from a nearby branch with the urgency of those surprised by joy. The months that followed were long and full in the good way, the way in which each day has weight, because each day builds something that will last. The adoption was concluded after months of procedures and interviews conducted with the patience of those who know the result is worth every stage, with Mr. Benedict and Mrs. Lewis serving as witnesses at a courthouse in Stamford on a December afternoon that was sunny, as if the weather had also been informed of the occasion. Isabel began using the Cavalcante surname with a serene naturalness indicating that, for her, the document had only made official what had been true for a long time. The civil ceremony took place in the mansion's garden on a February morning, without press, without a long speech, with the yellow Long Island rose bushes in bloom and Robert Drummond in the role of best man, with the dignity of someone who didn't need to understand everything to know he was in the right place. Christine Miller had cried, which had surprised everyone, including herself, and she had said afterward that she didn't know she was that kind of person until she was. Edward created the Mary Cavalcante Foundation. The name had been his suggestion, and her resistance had lasted exactly 3 days before yielding to the argument that foundation names need to remind people why they exist. The foundation was aimed at supporting single mothers wishing to pursue higher education, with scholarships for family income below twice the poverty line and a support network for childcare during the study period. It was the idea from a Friday afternoon, transformed into a structure that could last decades. Mary graduated in psychology, opened a practice within Cavalcante Developments itself, serving employees and their families for free, returning to the world the generosity she had received in that same company years before, in an office where a pen had fallen over an architectural plan, and everything had begun to be different. Isabel grew up with the second-floor library as her own sacred territory, chose medicine in her university applications with the determination of someone who has known for a long time what they want and didn't lose time getting there with hesitation. She told her father one Sunday afternoon that she was going to be a doctor and an architect, and whatever else there was time for, because life is long when we don't waste time on what doesn't matter. And Edward had noted that on the same stationery where she had written her own name for the first time with the Italian pens, and had kept it in the drawer of the oak desk in the private study, where one day a door had been pushed open by small hands and the world had changed direction. Edward became a lecturer at public and private universities, defending that behind every number on a payroll there is a story of struggle and a family that deserves to be seen, and speaking about what he had learned in the way that most matters, not in books or contracts, but on a Friday afternoon when a small hand had pulled a navy blue Italian silk tie and asked the simplest and most complete question someone had asked him in 43 years of life. The mansion that had been cold as a museum became a warm home, full of laughter, projects, orange windows and floor plans drawn with Italian pens and psychology books with graph paper sheets inside, and of a love that had resisted pressures, uncertainties, difficult nights, and the long weight of years of loneliness accumulated on two different sides of the same door. It all started with the pull of a small hand on a blue tie. It all started with a word a child shouted, without imagining the truth, that serious, wealthy and lonely man desperately needed to be exactly what she had said he was. Dear listeners, if the story of Edward, Mary and Isabel touched your hearts, it was told for that, to remind us that the greatest constructions in life rarely appear in the projects we plan, but in the encounters we didn't expect, and that change everything without asking permission. If you've made it this far, leave a like on this video. It's the simple gesture that helps more people find stories like this. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters of this journey, because every day we bring stories that explore what is most human in each of us. And tell us in the comments, what was the moment in this story that moved you the most? Was it when Isabel pulled the tie? When Mary handed over the envelope? When Edward fell on the grass laughing with his daughter in his arms? We read every response, and they inspire us to keep telling stories that are worth it. Until next time, and thank you for being here with us. Story end.